Hey there, and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought we could do something a little bit different in observance of Gay Pride Month, because I thought that we could spend some time together and I could tell you a little bit about my my trials and tribulations that I've been through. If you're looking for that happy-go-lucky story where everything ends up like, a fairy tale, this probably isn't the video for you. But if you're finding that you're having a tough time dealing with the idea of being gay yourself, or if you are dealing with a situation where your family is not completely understanding, then maybe you could share some of your story with me at the end. Um, so we flash back. God, I might get emotional during this. I hope I don't, because I feel like I'm putting myself out there a little bit more than I'm comfortable with. But if there's one person that sees similarities in their story and it helps, then I'm happy to share. I have nothing to lose. Um, so I grew up in a part of the US which in itself is not completely conservative, but if I could give you some background on my family, they're incredibly conservative. But they weren't always. Now, growing up, um, I had a pretty, good relationship with my family. I was one of those, like, people who just, like, I got on with my schoolwork. I had a part-time job at the age of 15. Like, I was doing all kinds of stuff. So my parents, they gave me a lot of freedom, because I was quite responsible. And then at the age of 16, everything kind of changed. And I say that because, so we'll go back 20 years. 20 years ago, things like AOL were popular and AIM, and that was such an interesting way to interact with people, because I felt like I could be somebody different than I could be around my family. That being said, I had made some friends online, and just trying to figure out what my place was in the world. And one day I was on the phone with one of them. I know how responsible giving out your phone number to somebody on the internet, right? I was on the phone with one of them, and this was, a long time ago. And I was on a cordless phone. And this cordless phone had incredible reach. Like, I could be anywhere in my house, even like outside. And a lot of times that's what I would do. I would go outside and get on the phone because I felt like I could have some privacy. Um, but one day my mom had picked up the phone and she heard a part of the conversation, which wasn't bad in itself, but we were talking along the lines of, who we thought was attractive and blah blah blah. And I didn't know my mom was there. Didn't know she was on the phone. I didn't hear her pick up the phone. I didn't hear her do any of that. And I remember her coming into my room, and she shut the door behind her, which was quite unusual. And she said, "Can I ask? First of all, hang up the phone, and there's something I need to ask you." So she asked me if I was gay, and I said to her, at first, to be fair, I think I was quite like, "What are you talking about?" Like, what any kid would be doing, right? Or any young person who's put in that situation. Like, what are you talking about? What? So I hung the phone, and she said to me, "And please don't come for my parents. They're just, I think that, don't come for them, all right? Because they did the best with what they had, right? Or what they knew." And my mom said, "Well, if you're gay, then you need to get out of our house." And at the age of 16, where does somebody go, right? Like, where was I supposed to go? So I ended up denying the whole thing and saying that it just wasn't true. I was like, "No, you must have misheard." And my mom is not dumb, right? Like, she clearly heard what she heard. And she just, like, broke down into tears. And I remember my dad got home that day, and they had gone into their bedroom, and closed the door, and I could hear my mom wailing, which broke my heart. And I remember thinking that, like, what have you done? Like, what have you done? And all of a sudden, all of that independence that I ever had came to a halt. I was like, I would go to work, and I feel like my parents were like my mom or dad, whatever. They would go to where I worked, just to kind of see if I was really there, and they would, call and ask me to pick up stuff on the way home, and that was, I think, their way of just making sure that I was there. I lost the ability to have any kind of privacy whatsoever. About a year later, I was 17, and I went off to college, and it was interesting how it worked because my parents were moving from my dad's job, but they stayed where we lived so that I could finish high school. And so they literally dropped me off um, on at university, and then they continued to drive to where they were moving to. And I remember, sorry, you can hear my cat. I don't know why he does this. Like, he waits for me to like do anything, like get on camera and whatever, and he decides he wants to talk. But he's cute, so we'll let it go. Anyway, so I had this huge distance from where I went to college versus where my parents lived, and I got that freedom back. Right, I still had a job. I was a full-time student. I was, doing fine. I was living my best life. But it was during this time that, during that independence, I got to a point where I felt like um, I couldn't share things with my family. I couldn't tell them anything, and it was sad. I mean, it was really genuinely sad because it led me to make friendships and be in relationships that I normally wouldn't have been in, except for the fact that I felt like I didn't deserve better. I was 18 and I had this partner who was physically abusive, and I'm not naming him, so don't come for me. Um, and during those times, like, you really need like your family and a support system to tell you that that's not right. But I had to live this life that, like, when I would go visit my parents over the summer holidays or Christmas, whatever, I never mentioned anything, so they didn't know. But I didn't think that I would have their support in saying that, you deserve better than this. And so I put myself through that. And it caused me to have like a lot of reckless behaviors. I found that I was drinking a lot, I was smoking, like all these different like forms of self-harm that I was going through because I felt like that's what I deserved, right? I broke my parents' heart, so why should you feel good about yourself? That's how I felt. Um, Fast forward, I finishing my bachelor's degree, and my parents said to us, or said to me, "Why don't you come, move back in with us, get a job where we live, and as soon as you get on your feet, then you get your own place." Well, I refused. I absolutely dead refused because I knew that going to live with them or being near them would give them, I wouldn't say permission, but it would give them the opportunity to kind of meddle in what I was up to, and I didn't want that. I was at college for 4 years, and I absolutely did not want to go back and feel like I'm being babysat and that I couldn't be who I was. Again, I think the distance thing, like I could where I was at college, I could just be myself and I could do whatever I wanted. I was kind of like a sovereign individual, But then if I were to move in with my parents or near them or anyone in my family, really, I felt that I would be making myself. I wouldn't be able to have that distance between the two lives that I lived, right? Like it would be all or nothing. And by this time, in the U.S., you finish college when you're like 21. So, and so I was there for 4 years, and so minus two for or one for, so it'd been 5 years since they initially found out, and it still hadn't gotten any better. Well, instead of moving back in with them, I said to myself, right, I'm going to go move somewhere further away, and I'm going to go to graduate school. So I did my first master's degree, and while I was there, I made some incredible friends, and it was a really interesting time in my life because I was moving to a state where I didn't know anybody. Literally, I got into this graduate program, and I remember I drove 21 hours to get there. I loaded up my car. I had a Volkswagen Jetta at the time, and it was so full of my stuff that it looked like a clown car. I remember I stopped to get gas, and people were like looking at my car laughing at me because it was so full. It was so ridiculous, right? It's so embarrassing. Anyway, but I had to do it all on my own. Like, no one was gonna come help me move. Who was gonna do that, right? Anyway, so I got to where I was going, and which was New Jersey. I'll just say it, why not? And so where I lived, I was like maybe 30 minutes from New York City and like an hour from Philadelphia. And so I was exposed to like this whole new world. Like, it was, I mean, incredible. And during that time, I really even grew up a lot more. It was the first time I like had my own apartment by myself. It was the first time where I got a brand new, fresh start. But then came the times of dread when Christmas would roll around, or Christmas, summer holidays, and I was expected to go home. During my time there, I was in a relationship that lasted. I was there for 4 years. So because then I did my degree, but then I got a job and I was still in that area. And and during that time, um, I I just used to dread going home. Like I never wanted to go back because again, I just couldn't be who I was. Then I moved. This was like when the economy started to go crazy, so that I moved to somewhere else. And I'll just say it. Why not? I moved to Texas. And when I lived there, again, I was living on my own. I had a good job. I didn't really need much of anyone, right? Um, and again, I got into some, I wouldn't say healthy relationships, but because again, that's what I thought I deserved, right? I had zero confidence. I had gained a lot of weight. I was drinking still far too often and too much at a time. It wasn't even like, I had a glass of wine every day. Like, it was really bad. It was really, really sad. And when I look back at it, it's such a painful time in my life. Um, so that being said, after I moved to Dallas, Texas, I made some of the best friends that I could have ever made. I was, playing in the softball league. I was all these kinds of different things, right? Um, and my parents had subsequently moved somewhere else, but I was closer to them in Texas than I was in New Jersey. So it was like an hour and a half, 2 hour flight, I think. So it was very easy to go back and forth. And so again, it was just like that dread. Well, fast forward, I lived in Dallas for 4 years, and I finally met after some really unhealthy and like weird relationships. I look back at them, I'm like, what the hell were you thinking? Like, what were you doing? Anyway, I guess desperate times call for desperate measures. I don't know. And it was in that time when I was in Dallas that I ended up meeting my husband, who happened to be in Dallas for work. And we met that night, and we decided, because he was living where we live now in Europe, and we thought, well, I was like, there's something about him, and I want to get to know him even more. And um, we were going back and forth, and it was really hard because like the time difference, you have to like really rearrange your sleep schedule, your day schedule, your finding ways to call. You had to just make it happen, right? And that's what we did, and it was hard ass work. I mean, it was hard work, but that's what happened. Um, then And you have to remember, I had never introduced anyone to my family before because I knew how painful it was for them, but at the same time, it was painful for me. Well, my current husband, or my only husband I've ever had, um, he had been in Dallas after we'd known each other for not very long, but we were talking so often it felt like we like lived in the same place, right? I ended up asking him to marry me, and we planned our wedding, which we got married in New Jersey because that's where some of my closest friends were. And for him to go from Europe and me from Dallas, it was just easier to meet somewhere closer to the to the middle between us. Not exactly the middle, but you know what I mean. And so I remember phoning my parents and saying to them, "Look, I'm getting married." And my mom cried on the phone, and she was like, "Is this really what you want?" And I was like, "Yeah, I mean, it is." And then she flew. He had come back like a couple weeks later, and she flew to meet him. And it was so awkward because I never, ever, ever asked my parents to meet a partner. I never talked about partners, never talked about relationships. And even though they knew that they were going on, like I had been dating people, I never put it to them. I never asked them questions. I never asked them for advice. I just left it, right? Um, and then what happened was, we had planned our wedding, and my mom said that she wanted to go. And I remember saying no, because if there's going to be any kind of drama whatsoever, then it's probably best that you don't. And one thing I'll say is that my parents are, um, they have a lot of conviction when it comes to religion, and even though they've never like quoted Bible stuff at me, um, I think that um, I it's easy for me to know how they feel. They don't have to necessarily say anything. But a lot of the distance that has been created between us over the years has been because of their opinions, right? Well, I ended up telling my mom I'm moving to Europe so we can be together. Because at the time, the U.S. government didn't recognize same-sex marriage for immigration purposes. So I had to move to the country that we live in now, and that was really difficult to up and move somewhere. I remember the day that I moved, and I packed my whole apartment into 3 suitcases. Everything else, like I put it on Craigslist, like I just wanted to get rid of it, right? And I remember boarding my plane from Dallas, and I had to connect. And I arrived in Newark, but I had to fly out of Kennedy, so I was in New Jersey for that whole day. So I was like, saying like some of my final goodbyes to some friends. And back up, my parents dropped me off at the airport in Dallas because even though they didn't agree with what I was doing, they thought that they at least wanted to see me off. Anyway, I ended up moving here, and it was tough. You know, when you first like get into a relationship with somebody, and you really you really don't know somebody till you live with them, and because we were living in different countries, it was difficult to have had that experience. Um, Never mind. And so now, um, my husband still travels for work, and he ends up sometimes in the city that my parents live in, and he stays with him, and they treat him amazingly. Um, but I wouldn't say that this is that happy ever after story because um, I know that my parents are, I probably have made them sound quite brute in this video, and I didn't mean for that because I think I could have done things very differently too. But I don't know. It still is really awkward. And one day I was watching this documentary about how gay people were treated in a different part of the world, and I said that you have to stop feeling sorry for yourself. Like, look, you have a good life. Like, yeah, it's not perfect, but you've made something of yourself and you're doing fine, right? You could have it a lot worse. So I don't want to sit around feeling sorry for myself, but this is one of those things that is a really painful thing for me to deal with. Even to this day, when I go visit my family, it's still really awkward. They, I don't know. I don't know. But I guess the whole point of me telling this story is that even though you might feel like things aren't going to get better, um, my remedy for that was to start trusting myself and to start believing that um, I am my own individual, and what somebody else, even my family members, think of me is not going to drive me down a path of continuous, alcoholism and food addiction. Well, it wasn't food addiction, but I was really overweight, smoking. I never did drugs, so I didn't have that, thank God. Um, but yeah, like I said, learn to trust yourself and know that even though your families or the people around you might not always be as supportive as you'd like, you have to do you. And if you don't, then you're going to live a miserable life. So the choice is yours. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me today. I hope it wasn't too late, too crazy or too depressing, whatever, because life is good, and as long as you do you, you're going to be happy. Thanks again for joining me. I'd always appreciate a comment, like, and subscribe. And by the way, if you need somebody to talk to, feel free to DM me on Twitter. It's Mike's Thoughts. I'm happy to have that conversation or support you however I can. Merci. Au revoir.